Socrates was famously put to death at the age of 70. It was 399 BC, and a jury of his fellow countrymen, chosen by lots, determined the guilty verdict. If this was a typical Athenian jury of his day, then the jury was made up of 500 men. The vote was close. Socrates lost by only 30 votes. The dialogue that Plato wrote about this trial focuses on Socrates' defense. The word apology actually comes from the Greek word meaning a court defense. People defended themselves in this system, and it was common to plead for mercy and leniency. I think it was from this behavior that the English word apology has taken on a meaning that differs from the original intention of the Greek word. Socrates, we will see, takes a different approach from the common. He launches an actual defense. Before we turn to that, though, let's look at the charges brought against him. 3 men filed the charges. There was a poet named Meletus. The second was a wealthy and socially prominent Athenian named Anytus. And the third was a professional rhetorician named Lycon. The charges they brought are 1, the classic charge of corrupting the youth, and 2, worshipping different gods than those of Athens. It runs something like this. Socrates is guilty of corrupting the minds of the young and of believing in deities of his own invention instead of the gods recognized by the state. Such is the charge. Socrates starts his defense by clarifying that he has much prejudice to overcome. I have already been accused in your hearing by a great many people for a great many years, though without a word of truth. And I am more afraid of those people than I am of Anytus and his colleagues, although they are formidable enough. Then he clarifies who the most dangerous accusers against him truly are. But the others are still more formidable. I mean the people who took hold of so many of you when you were children and tried to fill your minds with untrue accusations against me, saying, "There is a wise man called Socrates who has theories about the heavens and has investigated everything below the earth and can make the weaker argument defeat the stronger." It is these people, gentlemen, the disseminators of these rumors, who are my dangerous accusers, because those who hear them suppose that anyone who inquires into such matters must be an atheist. And this is a key passage. We will see as the dialogue continues that Socrates was actually a deeply spiritual man, and it was in fact his connection to the spiritual realm that may have been what doomed him in the eyes of the multitude who fear what they don't understand. Socrates had to overcome these prejudices against him. He understood that once someone has it in their mind that you are a bad person, it is very hard to overcome that. He begins his defense by explaining how his bad reputation came to be. I will try to explain to you what it is that has given me this false notoriety. He then proceeds to tell a story about his old friend Cheerophon, whose name means the sound of joy. Cheerophon asked a curious question to the priestess at the temple to Apollo in Delphi. One day he actually went to Delphi and asked this question of the god. He asked whether there was anyone wiser than myself. The priestess replied that there was no one. Socrates was baffled. He did not see himself as a person of any wisdom, yet he could hardly deny the words of a god. I set myself at last with considerable reluctance to check the truth of it in the following way. I went to interview a man with a high reputation for wisdom because I felt that here, if anywhere, I should succeed in disproving the oracle and pointing out to my divine authority, "You said that I was the wisest of men, but here is a man who is wiser than I am." On the surface, this may seem like a strange course of action, perhaps even sacrilegious. Why would he challenge a god and try to prove him wrong? I would suggest, however, that Socrates' attitude toward Apollo is the exact attitude that a student ought to have towards a teacher. He did not dismiss the words of the god outright. That would have been presumptuous. But he also did not blindly believe what he was hearing, or just accept it on face value. He needed to test the words himself to find in what way they were true. And this is a common theme, by the way, in spiritual practice. There is a lot of room for misunderstanding. So Socrates went ahead and questioned this man with a reputation for wisdom. Well, I gave a thorough examination to this person. I need not mention his name, but it was one of our politicians that I was studying when I had this experience. And in conversation with him, I formed the impression that although in many people's opinion, and especially in his own, he appeared to be wise, in fact, he was not. Then, when I began to try to show him that he only thought he was wise and was not really so, my efforts were resented both by him and by many of the other people present. However, I reflected as I walked away, well, I am certainly wiser than this man. It is only too likely that neither of us has any knowledge to boast of. But he thinks that he knows something which he does not know, whereas I am quite conscious of my ignorance. And then Socrates delivers what just might be the most famous line in all of Plato's dialogues. At any rate, it seems that I am wiser than he is to this small extent, that I do not think that I know what I do not know. This is often taken to mean that Socrates claims to know nothing. In fact, I've had people point to this precise quote in their efforts to try to convince me that philosophy is all about the questions. We can't expect to find any answers, they insist. So for them, apparently, wisdom is in asking clever questions. But this is not what Socrates is saying. Look at the quote again. He says that he does not think that he knows what he does not know. That means that he never confuses what he does know with what he does not know. In other words, he knows what knowing is. He knows what are the true objects of knowledge and what are not. Knowledge is not in a textbook or in being able to recite poetry or rattle off all of the elements in the periodic table. That is what most people think knowledge is. But Socrates understood that we only touch true objects of knowledge when we touch the realm of intelligible absolutes, as described in such dialogues as Republic and Symposium. Experiencing this realm matures into a state of mind that we might call human wisdom. Socrates demonstrates this wise state of mind throughout the bulk of Plato's dialogues. In this dialogue, however, he downplays its importance, stressing that true wisdom is only with the gods. Real wisdom is the property of God, and this oracle is his way of telling us that human wisdom has little or no value. It seems to me that he is not referring literally to Socrates, but has merely taken my name as an example, as if he would say to us, "The wisest of you men is he who has realized, like Socrates, that in respect of wisdom, he is really worthless. In truth, Socrates' words still touch souls and transform lives all these years after Plato wrote his dialogues. Those of us inspired by these dialogues recognize that human wisdom is not at all worthless. Perhaps what he was actually dismissing as worthless was the common image of human wisdom as the person who has a lot of information. This distinction between human wisdom as Socrates embodied it and human wisdom in the colloquial sense becomes clearer as his story progresses about questioning the people of Athens. After questioning this first politician, Socrates went on to question other people who had a reputation for wisdom. From that time on, I interviewed one person after another. I realized with distress and alarm that I was making myself unpopular, but I felt compelled to put my religious duty first. He felt that testing the oracle was his religious duty. He was not satisfied with his questions. He sought understanding and felt it was his religious duty to follow through. He questioned people from all walks of life, politicians, rhetoricians, poets, and even craftsmen. All fell short, thinking that their proficiency in one area made them experts in everything. On the strength of their technical proficiency, they claimed a perfect understanding of every other subject, however important, and I felt that this error more than outweighed their positive wisdom. So I made myself spokesman for the oracle and asked myself whether I would rather be as I was, neither wise with their wisdom nor stupid with their stupidity, or possess both qualities as they did. I replied through myself to the oracle that it was best for me to be as I was. This is a very sly way of dismissing what they call wisdom. Socrates understood that wisdom is not in technical proficiency or book knowledge. It comes through touching and understanding that realm of absolute realities, and it brings with it a deep love and appreciation for all that is divine. Socrates concludes this story by explaining to the jury that he deems the continued questioning of people to be his divine duty. That is why I still go about seeking and searching in obedience to the divine command. If I think that anyone is wise, whether citizen or stranger, and when I think that any person is not wise, I try to help the cause of God by proving that he is not. This occupation has kept me too busy to do much either in politics or in my own affairs. In fact, my service to God has reduced me to extreme poverty. Socrates goes on to question Meletus, one of his accusers. Meletus makes clear that he sees Socrates as an atheist, which differs from the stated charge of believing in deities of his own invention, instead of the gods recognized by the state. Tell me honestly, Meletus, is that your opinion of me? Do I believe in no God? Nope, none at all, not in the slightest degree. Socrates is quick to point out the contradiction between this statement and the official accusation. Is there anyone who believes in supernatural activities and not in supernatural beings? No. Well, do you assert that I believe and teach others to believe in supernatural activities? It does not matter whether they are new or old. The fact remains that I believe in them according to your statement. Indeed, you solemnly swore as much in your affidavit. But if I believe in supernatural activities, it follows inevitably that I also believe in supernatural beings. And indeed, this seems to be the crux of the real issue that put Socrates on trial. Socrates often talked of the gods. Nobody could seriously accuse him of being an atheist. but he embarrassed the powerful people of his day, and he did it in a way that tied into his strong sense of spirituality and virtue. It was the supernatural activities that he spoke of that most likely rattled the dogmatic fundamentalists of his day. But then couple this with his unwavering conviction that he was doing God's work by revealing to intellectuals their own lack of wisdom. I would argue that together this created the perfect storm to compel the movers and shakers of his day to silence him. To make this point clear, let me pull out a few more quotes. "It is my belief that no greater good has ever befallen you in this city than my service to the God. For I spend all my time going about trying to persuade you, young and old, to make your first and chief concern not for your bodies nor for your possessions, but for the highest welfare of your souls." And here's another example of his conviction. "It is literally true, even if it sounds rather comical, that God has specially appointed me to this city, as though it were a large thoroughbred horse, which because of its great size is inclined to be lazy and needs the stimulation of some stinging fly. It seems to me that God has attached me to the city to perform the office of such a fly." He then talks of his supernatural experiences, talk of which very likely made many of the intellectuals around him uncomfortable, and made their embarrassment at his hand all the more infuriating. He starts with the divine sign that has been with him since childhood. "You have often heard me say before on many other occasions that I am subject to a divine or supernatural experience, which Meletus saw fit to travesty in his indictment. It began in my early childhood, a sort of voice which comes to me, and when it comes, it always dissuades me from what I am proposing to do, and never urges me on." To put this in a modern context, imagine a typical intellectual of our day, someone who considers himself a moral person, whether religious or not, but who focuses on logic and reasoning when carrying on intellectual discussions. To such a person, Socrates would very likely seem like a crackpot, talking of being on a mission from God and of hearing a voice since childhood. Now imagine that this so-called crackpot tears all of the intellectual's best arguments to shreds and reveals him to be second-rate at best. I just have to conclude that Socrates' three accusers must have really hated him. Here is a section in the dialogue where Socrates clearly ties the divine messages he has received to his conviction that he is doing God's work by questioning people the way he does. "How is it that some people enjoy spending a great deal of time in my company? You have heard the reason, gentlemen. I told you quite frankly. It is because they enjoy hearing me examine those who think that they are wise when they are not, an experience which has its amusing side. This duty I have accepted, as I said, in obedience to God's commands, given in oracles and dreams and in every other way that any other divine dispensation has ever impressed a duty upon man." And so Socrates did not just embarrass high-ranking Athenians. He did so in a way that made clear that he felt commanded by God to do so. And he talked of divine communications in various forms, in oracles and dreams, and in every other way that any other divine dispensation has ever impressed a duty upon man. Socrates was not only challenging these men, but he was doing so from a position of moral righteousness, from a position of virtue. This had to have been a tremendous affront to the three men who brought charges against him. When the verdict was declared, Socrates made clear that his only surprise was at how close the vote had been. What does surprise me is the number of votes cast on the two sides. I should never have believed that it would be such a close thing, but now it seems that if a mere 30 votes had gone the other way, I should have been acquitted. It was customary in Athens at that time that upon a guilty verdict, each side proposed a penalty. The jury then chose between the two options. Naturally, those seeking the convictions would recommend a harsh penalty. That gave the guilty party the incentive to choose something that was more lenient, but not so light that the jury would reject it. In this case, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon recommended death. The penalty that many expected from Socrates would have been banishment. He explains, though, why that is not a realistic option for him. Perhaps someone may say, "But surely, Socrates, after you have left us, you can spend the rest of your life in quietly minding your own business." Now, this is the hardest thing of all to make some of you understand. If I say that this would be disobedience to God, and that is why I cannot mind my own business, you will not believe that I am serious. If, on the other hand, I tell you that to let no day pass without discussing and examining both myself and others is really the very best thing that a man can do, and that life without this sort of examination is not worth living, you will be even less inclined to believe me. Nevertheless, that is how it is, gentlemen, as I maintain, though it is not easy to convince you of it. The penalty Socrates ultimately chose was a fine, paid for by his friends since he himself had very little money. He did not land on this penalty, however, before stating what he felt was the most appropriate way for Athens to treat him. Well, what is appropriate for a poor man who is a public benefactor and who requires leisure for giving you moral encouragement? Nothing could be more appropriate for such a person than free maintenance at the state's expense. He deserves it much more than any victor in the races at Olympia. As we all know, this was not the outcome for Socrates. He was sentenced to death. He insists throughout this dialogue, both before the reading of the verdict and after, that death is nothing to fear. For let me tell you, gentlemen, that to be afraid of death is only another form of thinking that one is wise when one is not. It is to think that one knows what one does not know. No one knows with regard to death whether it is not really the greatest blessing that can happen to a man. But people dread it as though they were certain that it is the greatest evil. And this ignorance, which thinks that it knows what it does not, must surely be ignorance most culpable. I suggest, gentlemen, that the difficulty is not so much to escape death. The real difficulty is to escape from doing wrong, which is far more fleet of foot. Comparing his fate to that of his three accusers, Socrates says, "When I leave this court, I shall go away condemned by you to death, but they will go away convicted by truth herself of depravity and wickedness, and they accept their sentence even as I accept mine. No doubt it was bound to be so, and I think that the result is fair enough." He ends his speech by making clear that he holds no grudge against those who convicted him, and he asks that his sons be cared for as he himself had cared for the people of Athens. "When my sons grow up, gentlemen, if you think that they are putting money or anything else before goodness, take your revenge by plaguing them as I plagued you. If you do this, I shall have had justice at your hands, both I myself and my children." He ends on what is either a hopeful or an ominous tone. It depends on your perspective, and I'll leave it for you to decide. Now it is time that we were going, I to die and you to live. But which of us has the happier prospect is unknown to anyone but God. Well, there are a number of issues touched on in this dialogue that could easily branch off into a video of its own. What is knowledge? What is the voice that spoke to Socrates? And so on. So if there's anything that you would like me to discuss further, please let me know in the comments. And also, please share with us all any insights that you've had from this dialogue. I'm sure we'd all love to read them. And as always, thanks for watching. Till next time.